The Persian Empire was a creature of war. It rose from the ashes of the Assyrian Empire, rapidly absorbed the Near East through violent conquest, and dominated the region until Alexander the Great destroyed it in the second half of the 4th century BC. At first, the Persians were part of the Median Empire, but in 555 BC, Cyrus the Great of the House of the Achaemenids forcefully seized the throne, paving the way for the Achaemenid dynasty, which would rule Persia for more than 200 years. The success of the Achaemenid Empire was largely due to its vast, effective, and well-organized military force. At the head of this force marched the infamous Immortals, the Persian heavy infantry. The Achaemenids were the first to make the cavalry their central striking force, who rely on large-scale naval warfare and use size to guarantee success. But what exactly did their armies look like, and how did they fight? Those questions puzzle historians to this day. In this video, we'll explore what we actually know about the armies of the Achaemenid Empire, including how they fought and what was the key to their success. Cyrus the Great ruled his growing empire from the city of Pasargadae, just north of today's Madur el-Soleiman. A remarkably capable military leader as well as an astute administrator, he very quickly created a large, complex and diverse empire. One key to his success was how he treated the societies he conquered. Instead of imposing Persian culture and traditions upon them, he respected local religions, kept local officials in place, and disrupted everyday life as little as possible. He appointed governors, known as satraps, for each province. These satraps ruled in the king's name, offering him their military service and paying him tribute. Aside from this change, life in the provinces largely continued as it had before. Because of this generous treatment, many saw Cyrus and his successors as liberators rather than occupiers. Over time, the Achaemenid Empire grew into a vast patchwork of cultures and peoples. Cyrus and his son Cambyses II conquered Lydia, Egypt and Babylon. At its greatest extent, in the times of Darius the Great, the empire stretched all the way from Greece to India. The military requirements of such a vast state were staggering. Endless borders, countless invasions, and numerous uprisings could only be managed with a large and effective army. Unfortunately, Persian primary sources provide little information about the equipment, organization, and tactics of its military, forcing us to rely on archaeological sources and descriptions from outsiders, such as the Greek writer Herodotus. While Herodotus is a prolific source, his reports should always be taken with a grain of salt. This becomes clear when considering his account of the size of the Persian army King Xerxes the Great marched to Greece in 480 BC. Quote, "I cannot give the exact number that each part contributed to the total, for there is no one to tell us that, but the total of the whole land army was shown to be 1,700,000, end quote. Modern historians unequivocally agree that this is impossible. However, they also agree that the Persian army was indeed immense. To meet the military challenges of their empire, the Achaemenid kings were probably able to muster up to around 300,000 men at a time. To put this into perspective, a force of this size would be comparable to some of the biggest armies of the Napoleonic era. However, it is important to note that we're talking about armies raised for a specific purpose, not a standing national army. Persian armies consisted of a small core of standing troops that was reinforced by additional levies and mercenaries when a bigger army was needed. The core of the Persian army was the infamous 10,000 Immortals, a standing force of heavy infantry mainly recruited from the central Persian territory. These elite fighters probably looked nothing like they were portrayed in the 2006 epic movie 300, although Herodotus did describe them as Xerxes' finest warriors. Instead, they would have looked somewhat like this. If you like this image, you can purchase it along with most of our artwork as prints in our merch store, which is linked in the description below. Many details about the 10,000s are shrouded in myth, but we know that there were two royal household regiments at their heart. One was the royal guard of 1,000 infantrymen that carried both bows and spears, as depicted here. They're often called apple bearers due to the apple-shaped butts of their spears. The other household regiment consisted of 1,000 cavalry, they were similarly armed but never depicted in wall carvings. The remaining 8,000 were also infantry, armed with spears and bows. This core of professional fighters was reinforced by three groups: non-professional Persian soldiers, provincial or satrapal armies, and mercenaries. Mercenaries, as we discussed in our video on the first mercenaries in history, can be challenging to identify. In the case of the Achaemenid rulers, however, it seems clear that they relied on mercenaries from very early on. At least 125 sources plausibly hint at the use of mercenaries during this period. The most famous example of mercenary usage during this time is probably the 10,000 Greeks employed by Cyrus the Younger to seize the throne from his brother Artaxerxes II. In this climactic battle of their service, the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BC, their master Cyrus was killed, and they had to fight their way back to Greece. One of their leaders was the Greek writer Xenophon, who recorded the story of their service in his work Anabasis. The Persian non-professional soldiers were recruited in a sort of militia system. According to Pierre Briant, who wrote a groundbreaking 1196-page history of the Persian Empire, the Achaemenids had a system of granting land to tenant farmers in exchange for military service. This system, known as Hatru, determined the required military participation dependent on the size of allotted land. We'll come back to the Persian soldiers shortly, but first, let's talk about the fighters who made up the bulk of most Persian armies, the satrapal armies. These armies were raised by individual provinces in a variety of ways. The main job of these satraps was to protect the king's lands and enforce his authority. They were responsible for civilian and military affairs, and the king expected them to handle minor uprisings and border quarrels themselves. To accomplish this, they were allowed to raise troops on their own and unite forces in the event of more significant threats. This was the case, for example, when Sparta invaded Persia in 398 BC, and the satraps of Lydia and Phrygia joined forces against the invaders. More commonly, however, the king called upon his satrapal armies to support the royal armies in a major military campaign. Every satrapy was obliged to supply levies and actively participate if required. For example, Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, commanded the wing in the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, in which Alexander the Great defeated Darius III. This battle is often considered the final blow to the Achaemenid Empire. The non-Persian contingents of the army from the satrapies were as different as the empire itself. Herodotus may be spinning tales when he describes the fighters with pelts, clubs, and wooden helmets, or Sargatian nomads with lassos on horseback. But even if we don't take him literally, it becomes clear that the Achaemenid armies were anything but uniform. This was both their biggest weakness and their greatest strength. By incorporating provincial troops, the Persians were able to assemble armies larger than any seen before. This gigantism became a characteristic of Achaemenid warfare. For them, size was the ultimate assurance of success. Indeed, in many cases, they overwhelmed their enemies purely through the sheer force of their numbers. The drawback of this approach was that the resulting force lacked tactical coherence due to the mixture of local levies, each of which had different military traditions and fought in their own ways. This diversity makes it almost impossible to say anything about the Achaemenid army as a whole, which is why we need to focus on its Persian components in our further investigations. If you now shall think that how many are the countries which King Darius held, look at the sculptures of those who bear the throne, then you shall know. The spear of a Persian man has gone forth far. A Persian man has delivered battle far indeed from Persia. In this description on the tomb of Darius the Great, the spear becomes a symbol of the Achaemenid army as a whole. This is no coincidence. Along with the bow, the spear was the most important weapon of the Persian army. Both are omnipresent in pictorial sources, and were used by both infantry and cavalry. The average Persian infantryman was an archer spearman equipped with a bow, a short spear, a dagger, and a light wicker shield, although other types, like this figure 8 shield, were also in use. In descriptions, they often wear some form of headgear and a robe, as in this relief from Persepolis. The robe certainly does not seem very practical for fighting, which is why historians think it was merely used to distinguish figures of high standing in artwork, but not actually worn in combat. Instead, the average soldiers wore trousers and a tunic. In addition, as Herodotus and Strabo inform us, there were various types of body armor, most commonly scale-covered cuirasses. We have an idea what these looked like thanks to severely corroded pieces of scale armor found at Persepolis and Pasargadae. As for weapons, reliefs and mural paintings depict two types of bows with two types of quivers. One of them was carried over the shoulder, one at the belt. The bows themselves were large and distinctive, and according to Herodotus could easily outshoot those of the Cretan archers who were some of the best in Greece. However, again, take this with a grain of salt. The form of the bows varied according to the origin of the archers, but generally speaking, there were two types. A simple convex recurve bow like this one, and one with an additional recess in the grip area resembling the Greek letter sigma. The latter is depicted in the Phmaihu jewel and on vase paintings. Apart from spears and bows, Persian soldiers also used axes and maces, slings and various daggers and swords. The weapons that are frequently found in pictorial sources are this dagger with an asymmetrical scabbard and the so-called akinakis, a short weapon associated with the riding costume. Clearly, the equipment of Persian soldiers varied, but a short spear and the bow were standard. Now, let's find out how these armies operated in battle. Mount Behistun in Iran bears a royal inscription praising the deeds of Darius the Great. Known as the Behistun inscription, it provides a clue as to how his armies were organized. At the heart of any Achaemenid army was the king. The historian Christopher Hassan writes, quote, "From Cyrus II's first victory over the Medes around 559 BC to the defeat of Darius III by Alexander the Great in 331 BC, the armies of Persia answered unequivocally to the great king. Even if the king wasn't present in person, he always held the authority over major campaigns." The Behistun inscription, however, suggests that this policy might have been somewhat flexible. When he was faced with multiple rebellions, Darius the Great transferred command over several armies to subordinate commanders, while he coordinated them and led the main force, which allowed him to quell all rebellions almost simultaneously. This diffusion of military power gave the Persian army the ability to respond quickly and effectively to multiple minor conflicts at the same time. Similarly, there are examples in which a king delegated command to a trusted general. For example, the Aegean campaign of 490 BC, which led to the famous Battle of Marathon, was commanded by Datis, a Mede, and Artaphernes, Darius' nephew. During campaigns, the king or general was surrounded by a personal retinue of kinsmen and retainers on horseback, sometimes acting as elite infantry. Lesser nobility formed the bulk of the cavalry, while the common soldiers made up the infantry. According to Herodotus, the Persian army was organized in units of 10, meaning a regiment was made up of 10,000 soldiers, divided into 10 companies of 1,000, groups of 100, and squads of 10, with a corresponding officer hierarchy. This system of command gave the Persians significant control over their armies and made it possible for different squadrons to perform different tasks, a capability that was far from assured at the time. Because there are so few sources available, it's hard to know how the Persian army lined up for battle, much less the tactics they used. Still, there are a few things we can say. The king and the Persian troops usually formed the center, while the mercenaries and satrapal armies fought on the wings. The native Persians were assigned the most critical battle positions and entrusted with the most vital missions. For example, at the famous Battle of Thermopylae, some of them were dispatched to march around the Spartans who were blocking the mountain pass after the traitor Ephialtes revealed a secret path. The front fighters, known as Parabara, formed a defensive line with their shields, while their comrades in the back weakened the enemy with a barrage of arrows. Then, the cavalry attempted to outflank the enemy, while the infantry launched a frontal attack. As with the infantry, the Persians also relied on mass with the cavalry and navy. In fact, they elevated both of these military divisions to a whole new level. Since being initially introduced by the Assyrians, cavalry units were widespread in the Near East. In fact, Cyrus himself had faced the famous horsemen of King Croesus when he invaded Lydia in 547 BC. There, Herodotus tells us, Cyrus defeated the Lydian cavalry by sending camels against them, exploiting the horses' natural fear of these beasts. Be that as it may, Cyrus conquered the Lydian capital of Sardis and made Lydia a province of his empire. After 539 BC, however, Cyrus looked farther east, perhaps even as far as the wide plains of modern-day Afghanistan. There, cavalry was a necessity. In the next years, Cyrus developed his own cavalry force. According to the World History of Warfare, it would eventually become the dominant branch of the Persian army. From then until the era of Napoleon, cavalry was the most important mobile striking force. According to Christopher Tuplin, cavalry played a dominant role in a significant portion of recorded military actions. We do not know the exact nature of that role, however, because the evidence is simply too ambiguous to identify patterns or even tactics. Generally speaking, historians agree that the Persian cavalry rarely used shock tactics, but rather played a flanking, harassing, or pursuit role. So we don't know a lot, but we know this. The Persian kings clearly understood the tactical potential of cavalry and its use on the battlefield. Transporting and supplying the empire's gigantic armies presented its own challenges. This could explain why the Achaemenids were the first to make naval warfare an integral part of large-scale warfare. Ships had been used in combat since prehistoric times, and it was primarily the Greeks and Phoenicians who made the most significant innovations in naval warfare during this period. However, as historian Arther Ferril explains, quote, "The Persians were the first to make use of it on a large scale and created a major naval presence in the Mediterranean. At its peak, their navy boasted up to 800 ships. They mainly used triremes, which were fast, maneuverable, and resistant oared vessels, ideal for fighting. Most of them came from the satrapies in the Mediterranean region, from Anatolia, Cyprus, the Levant, Egypt, and Greece. So, as with the land army, the Achaemenids used the existing resources and skills of the satrapies, rather than building their own fleet. Despite our limited certain knowledge about the Achaemenid armies, one thing is clear: they were a true military giant. Herodotus was not entirely wrong when he wrote that the Persians were taught nothing but, quote, "to ride, to draw the bow, and to speak the truth." The strength of their armies came from their sheer mass, their traditional archer spearmen, their proficient cavalry, and their ability to supply huge armies across great distances. This allowed them to dominate the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean for almost 200 years. For much of this time, the northwestern border was the greatest challenge for the Achaemenids. There, the armies of Greece and Macedonia successfully fended off Persian attempts of conquest in the 5th century BC. Then, in the 4th century BC, the armies of Alexander the Great finally brought the mighty Achaemenid giant to its knees. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to check out our merch store and have a look at the artwork prints that we offer there. Also, thanks to all our patrons for the continuous support. This channel would long have been bankrupted if it wasn't for you guys. So again, thank you.